Welcome to Bibliophiles, the program on AADL TV, where we take a moment on each episode to talk about one book topic. Today's episode is a little different, a little special, because all three of us read the same book, and we are going to discuss that book. I'm Lucy, and I'm here with Christopher and Amanda as usual. And the book that we are talking about today is Concrete Rose by Angie Thomas. And this came out in early 2021. And it is the prequel to The Hate U Give. So it takes place 17 years before The Hate U Give. And it is about a character in The Hate U Give. And I have so much to say about this book. But before we get into it at all, I also just want to say that, I am here for Angie Thomas. I think she is such a good writer, and I will read. I've read all three of her books, and I'm going to read anything she writes. So this is the story of Maverick, who is Star Carter is the main character in The Hate U Give, and Maverick is her father. And when we meet Maverick in The Hate U Give, he's like a really upstanding pillar of community. And I think it's interesting to get his origin story here and to see how he got there. Well, we don't even get all the way there, but to see someone who's really real, and he certainly has a lot of struggles. And because he starts off with this book, he's just finding out as a teenager that he is actually a father as well. So right away, we jump into this question of masculinity and boyhood and manhood and the in-between. And I think that, I don't know what you guys think, but Angie Carter does such a good job of giving Maverick a unique voice in this book. She writes so well as a 17-year-old, and she writes so well as a male. I was really impressed with the dialogue.
She said it was the first time she was writing from having that male protagonist from that male point of view.
Mm-hmm.
And I just loved his voice so much. I loved hearing his perspective and his point of view of this young Mav. I guess it takes place in 98, 99.
Mm-hmm.
I was just drawn. It was just, I loved being back in the garden with these characters and hearing and not just about Mav and Lisa and his mom and the people that are close, but even little characters that pop up. One of the customers in the grocery store is a character in another story. So little things like that just set the scene for the whole city, I thought was really awesome. I loved being back in that with those. And she did such a great job with his voice. I thought so.
So I haven't read The Hate U Give. I've only seen most of the movie, and I just loved the movie. And then I read On the Come Up. So I was a little nervous to read this just because because I knew it was a prequel. I thought it's going to be a tacked on story, not really fleshed out well. It's going to feel like it's not integral to The Hate U Give. And like I said, I haven't read that, but I was so drawn into this book. It is such a fast read. It's so rich. I read a review online that said it's not as action-packed as The Hate U Give, but so I don't know if that's true or not, but the book moves so quickly and the characters are so interesting and alive. So I loved it. Thought it was great.
I was just going to say, you can totally read Concrete Rose without having read The Hate U Give, or vice versa. I mean, I don't know why you wouldn't want to read both of them. And I would probably read this in publication order. I think I would read The Hate U Give first, if I haven't read any of them yet, and then read Concrete Rose. Kind of like with Star Wars, you watch the ones that came out first. That's my opinion anyway. But you can totally read them independently of each other, which was also cool. Because for Christopher, even the movie adaptation, there's slight differences with the book, but you can still read this as a standalone piece and just, get inside the character and just really feel their. So we have Mav, he's 17. He lives with his single mom. His dad is in prison for drugs. Was it murder? Drugs? Either one or the other. And so Mav is finding out he's 17, and he finds out he's going to be a dad. Or he finds out they do a DNA.
He is a dad, yeah.
They do a DNA test, and he finds out he's got this kid. And so he wants to go straight. He doesn't want to deal drugs anymore. He doesn't want to be in the gang anymore. He wants to go straight to support the baby. but he has no money. He starts working at a grocery store. He's got no money. So the whole book, he has like this internal struggle of like, I want to have money to support buy the diapers and the formula, and new shoes for myself and not raggedy clothes for school. But also like, I don't want to be in the gang anymore. I don't want to deal with drugs anymore. But he's realizing that going the straight life and working at the grocery store, he's working all the time. He's in school. He's got a baby. He is exhausted. So there's this constant like mental struggle of this emotional, like, what is the best choice for me? And ultimately he finds out and decides what he needs to do. But I just loved his voice of this battle of like, I know what's right, but I also know this other way that should be right too. So.
Yeah, I think the sort of mental burden that he feels and that he struggles with, I think it's like important that she put that in here, and that she shows that like, here is this Black teenage boy who's in a gang, is supposed to be this like tough life, and he is really struggling with some issues mentally. And then she has another piece, like, he is taking care of his son because the mother of his son actually has postpartum depression, and it's just like, I can't do this right now. And I think that Angie Burden treats those things like respectfully, and not, she's showing us mental illness without stigmatizing it. And I just think that was an interesting piece to show us like how there's so much in Maverick's mind here. And I think he defies stereotypes.
I think Angie Thomas does such a great job of humanizing all of the characters. They're not Hollywood roles. Every one of these characters that she introduces in the book, they're all very real. And I think it's such an important book for that reason too.
Well, that's so the title of the book, Concrete Rose, and The Hate You Give are both throwbacks to lyrics and songs by Tupac Shakur. And with Concrete Rose, there's roses that grow from the concrete. And I was just listening to the song before this, and if you look at the lyrics, it mentions something like, you don't notice the defects in the petals. All you notice is, wow, a rose grew from the concrete. You don't notice those little flaws. And that's a perfect metaphor for what's happening to the characters in this book, like throughout the whole book. And also I loved how since with the title Concrete Rose, I loved how the chapters were kind of divided into like the growth of a rose. We've got germination, growth, dormancy, and a bud. And I just thought that was a great like metaphor for looking at Mav and his personal growth. I also super love him working at the grocery store, and I love that he gets into gardening. I just loved hearing and reading his little thoughts about, like, he was digging in the soil, and he mentioned how the sweet soil, it smells like, it smells like when the sun comes out after a rainy day, like everything smells fresh. So those little insights that are just like making him come alive and see that there is something else. There is a rose inside that concrete, and it could be him as well as the roses he's helping cultivate in the store owner's garden. So that was another great metaphor for just like personal growth. Yeah,
and that job that he has with Mr. Wyatt, like, I think Mr. Wyatt is such a good, strong, like, role model for him. And I was thinking when you were saying, Christopher, like how all these people are so humanized, I have this quote from Mr. Wyatt here where he says, "Son, one of the biggest lies ever told is that Black men don't feel emotions. Guess it's easier to not see us as human when you think we're heartless. Fact of the matter is we feel things, hurt, pain, sadness, all of it. We got a right to show them feelings as much as anybody else." And I just think that like is such a good encapsulation of all the flawed characters, but like Angie Thomas, it's like she's speaking through Mr. Wyatt because she's doing this with her characters. So
I just wanted to bring up the end of the book, and I don't know how much we'll talk about it, but I hadn't read The Hate You Give, so I didn't have the main character's name foremost in my head, but I still thought I thought the ending scene was very effective, and I should have seen it coming, but I didn't, and I thought it was beautiful. The last couple pages of the book were really lovely. So
I totally agree with him trying to figure out the name of the second baby he is about to have.
Yeah.
And it goes right into Star, and then the hate her story, where her dad now is a shop owner. And I just love the two stories together. I read this the other day. I read it in 2 sittings, and I was just in love with it. And I don't know if it was just where I was. It was a nice day. I was reading it in the yard, but I just had a great time with it. I should have expected it, but I didn't expect, with Dre, like when Dre gets killed and he's there, I just was like, oh no. And I should have known something like that was going to happen to like push him even further into like changing an evolution and trying to get away from like the drug life or the gang that runs in his family, like so deep. But I was just like sobbing, but also like you needed that to happen. And also I love that Dre was a little bit older than him. He was his cousin, and he had him as a role model because Dre was totally in love with his baby girl. He had like a 3 or 4 year old. And it was just he had him as this role model. And one of other, I don't know if King says it, one of his friends say something like, you're here, you're still here. Dre's gone, but now you've got to live for him too. Not just for you and your baby. You got to live for Dre and do the things he can't do. So he just has a lot of like positive role models and people in his life who are spurring him on to like make those changes, do the right thing. Even though he's a baby, he's only 17 and he has these huge choices and things to make in his life, like making the right decisions. And he doesn't always make the right choices. But again, as Christopher was saying, like it's a human character. Like you've got to have these flaws. I could just talk forever about this book.
I know. I loved Dre counseling him. This is like one of those moments where, first of all, it's like, Angie Thomas is not a parent, but there are moments when she writes in this where I'm like, how did you not? You seem like someone who had a little baby, because it's like 7 won't stop crying and Maverick's just like, I can't do it. So he walks out of the house and closes the door. And it's like, I remember that constant crying. And you're like, I just need 2 seconds of quiet. How do I get, but what I love about that scene is you have Dre there being like, it's okay that you walked out, but the thing is now it's important that you go back in. And like, that's what, like that kind of just that really wise advice from someone who's not much more of a kid himself.
Yeah.
That again goes to like just create these fully realized characters throughout the book.
Yeah.
I did love to, and I read The Hate You Give when it first came out, and that was 2017. So it's been a minute. And so I didn't remember all of the pieces, but as the different names were popping up, like Miss Rosalie, and then Red. And then when they mentioned that Red's baby was Khalid, and knowing how Khalid goes in The Hate You Give, I was just like, oh, that's Khalid. And so all these little pieces. Yeah. I just love those little pieces.
I didn't realize there were so many common characters shared between the 2 books.
And again, you can read them independently, but it's just for someone who read the first book, just having those pieces, like knowing like that's how that became like Star's best friend. And then knowing that Star was there, like when it was just, really good stuff.
But Christopher, I think it'll be interesting if you read The Hate You Give now too, like to read them in chronological order. That's just a different way of doing it. And there's a hole, like there's an opportunity here for her to give us another Garden Heights book, because we know where Maverick starts in The Hate You Give, but Concrete Rose doesn't, like, we don't see the piece where he sort of gets out of, there's like a chunk that's missing a little bit.
Yeah.
Like
how he gets
like we know he goes to jail, right, from The Hate You Give. And that's how he gets out of the gang.
Yeah.
But that doesn't happen in Concrete Rose. So
I feel like,
but also, sorry, but just like one more point to that I think that's really good too, because she's not ending the book with a Black teenage boy in prison.
Yeah.
And I just think that is great.
Yeah. I feel like she could pluck any one of her characters, like Mr. Wyatt, and then tell a whole story about him. It could just never end with all of these fascinating characters. I mean, don't you wonder about his background, or the principal of the school, what his background is, or just any of the characters? It's
Mr. Wyatt would be fun because he and his wife ended up being a foster for so many of those kids in the neighborhood,
And he's got so many little pieces of wisdom to dispense. Like how did he develop that mind?
It's just, it's not, and we mentioned like the overlap of characters, but it's not so deep where there's like 400 characters you have to keep track of. It's just little snippets. Like you read a name and you're like, oh yeah, that kid shows up in the other book. It's just a brief moment. So you don't have to keep track of anybody. But it was fun. And it's funny because having read Hate You Give and having watched the movie The Hate You Give, when I was picturing like the interaction between like King and Aisha, I was visualizing what the house looked like in the movie version of Hate You Give, even though they were like more adults, you know, in that film or in that book versus here when they were getting together. Anyways. Well, obviously we really enjoyed this book. We're huge Angie Thomas fans.
Yeah, as I said before, anything she writes, I'm going to read it because I'm so impressed with how she can manufacture such different narrative voices in the 3 novels that I've read of hers. So.
Yeah, and Hate You Give, it's one of those books that's like controversial and ends up on banned list. And I was just reading an interview with Angie Thomas, and somebody mentioned like, do you think this book will end up being on a banned book list? And she said, I hope it is. That means it's a good one. So.
Right. Well, so we probably could talk about this for hours and hours more, but we're just going to say you should read it and read The Hate You Give and On the Come Up, and then anything else Angie Thomas writes from this point on. So thank you for joining us for our discussion of Concrete Rose. We will be back next time to talk about a book about animals. So we'll see you then.